On LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, just about everywhere, and we're live in person. So, all right, let's get this show rolling. Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I will be your host. And I'm joined with my good friend Doug Hayren. Hey, Doug.
Good morning, Kirk. Hey, apologies to everybody that's been waiting, anxiously for the last 15 minutes for a start. I am the reason that it started late. And, Kirk understands, you're more interested when I'm on the show. So he didn't want to start early without me. So we're here now.
Well, to be fair, Doug, it was sort of your issue, but it was also sort of Microsoft's issue. It's an Outlook issue, right?
Well, yeah, there is a new setting that I've
Technology.
learned. There's a new setting I've learned for all of you Microsoft users out there as they've revamped it. When you are doing an out of office, which I've been for the last couple of days due to some, Minnesota education, basically fall break. When you set this, you can select a button that says, hey, I'm gonna be out of the office these days. It used to be just reply. I'm sorry, I'm out of the office. Here's my auto response. Well, now it has a selection that will actually cancel all the meetings that were already on your schedule and automatically. And unfortunately, I must have tried that and it works. So the good news is it's highly functional. The bad news is if you're not aware of what was canceled, it's gone. And like money, great segue, once it's gone forever. So let's talk more about that.
Yeah, and at least it's not the Minnesota re-education program that you were participating in, Doug.
Well, they got plenty of those things too, but I wasn't forced into that one. So
not yet.
And we're certainly not looking forward to any of that. But we're very close to Canada. Oh, hopefully.
Oh, wait. Anyway, we won't talk about Canada. Anyway, so let's dive right in. So there's a bunch of things we want to get to today, and I think these are all really important. And I wanted to start actually with a question from a listener. And it was this listener's Chad, and he said, "Thank you for your content. I'm a regular listener and thoroughly enjoy your show. I've heard you mention several times you don't watch the news, but you have specific sources you go to for news and information. Would you be willing to share those sources with me? Constantly on the lookout for good information and would love to glean insight if you have any good content." Well, Chad, that's a great question and appreciate you pointing it out because we do mention a lot in the show and we don't mention what those sources are. And for good reason, not because we don't want to share, because frankly, I share virtually everything I can. I'm able to, regulatory wise, on the show without giving advice. But I did want to touch on this because, it gets into a few different topics here. So the first is, it's not so much about the sources. Okay, the sources. I don't have magical sources from the Magical Source Fairy. This is literally things that I have cultivated over 24 years of my career. And there are some great sources out there, and I try to share those in the show. So those I don't keep secret. However, what it's really more about, and this is what we try to teach on this show, is it's not the information that matters. There's a plethora of information out there. There's too much of it, right? You Google search 401k and you're going to get 10 million sources, and 5 million are going to say one thing and 5 million are going to say the opposite. That's the world we live in, right? We have polarizing information, and information is geared towards a certain class of people, whether it's Democrats or Republicans. They're saying the opposite thing with the same set of data, right? I don't know who's right. I'm not here to judge, right? That's not the point. The point is that you can have one set of data and you can have many people looking at it many different ways. So the source of news isn't really important because news nowadays is opinion. I wish it wasn't, but it is. And if you don't realize that, I would argue take a hard look at where you're getting information. Okay, you might say, well, no, CNN, they're accurate, or it's Fox News, they're accurate. None of them are accurate. They're all geared towards getting your attention. They're geared towards selling you ads and getting you to watch. Because if they just told you what the information was, nobody would watch. CNN tried that. They were left leaning for quite some time. They used to be called the Clinton News Network back when Clinton was in office. So they've been around for a while and they've had that tilt for a while. However, there was a time, I don't know, 12 months ago, where they were doing some turnover and they decided, hey, maybe we should try being a little bit more even. They tried that for a few months and realized nobody's watching. So they went back towards left leaning. Okay. Not good or bad. If you like that sort of thing, great. Watch that. I'm not here to judge. But you should know that you're only getting half of the picture. So when I'm looking at where I get my information or news or opinions, I'm looking at the information or data or news source. I don't want to call it news because it's not news, but information source. I'll call it that. Where I get my information source is a variety of places. Some of them are left leaning, some of them are right leaning, some of them are agnostic. It's all over the map. But what I'm looking for is how accurate is this person at telling the future? Now, you might think, well, nobody can tell the future, Kirk. Yes, that is absolutely correct. No one can tell the future. However, your lens on the world, so how you see the world, the better of a lens that you have, the more accurate of a lens you have, the better you are at telling the future. So if you're really good at predicting future events, and I don't mean like, withstanding, one-off things that you can't predict, like COVID, right? I mean, some people say, well, I predict COVID. Sure. And you probably predicted COVID for the 10 years prior to that. But let's just say you predicted COVID because of some rational reason, and you're also really good at predicting other things. I would say you have a pretty good lens on the world because you're able to predict things that are very, let's say, unpredictable. So if you predicted Trump winning the presidency when he won, you have a pretty good lens on the world because virtually everybody was predicting he wouldn't win. So if you predicted, and it wasn't having to do with you being a Republican, and I want to be very clear because if many Republicans choose for Republicans, many Democrats choose Democrats, right? But if you said, you know what, he's going to win, and here's why, and those reasons actually cause him to win, and you say, oh, this person has some good insight, and there are some people out there who are good at that. Now, you could go back and say these people accurately predicted, and say, okay, I should watch this person. Right? This person has a good lens in the world and the rationale is pretty interesting. I should pay attention to that. Now, I do the same thing for finance. I also do it for politics and other realms of society, but for finance it's interesting because you have these people who are perma bulls. Everything's bullish all the time. Oh, buy the dip. Oh, it's down. Who cares? Buy the dip. Buy more. You don't have any cash left? Go and leverage. Just buy. Buy. These people are perma bulls, and be warned, they're perma bulls. Now, that being said, the market goes up 70% of the time. If you look at an annualized basis, in the last 100, 110 years, 70% of the years, the market's going to be positive. So you have a right to be bullish. If you're a perma bull, you're going to be more bullish than bearish, right? Warren Buffett's really good at this. No one was ever successful betting against the American economy. He's right. So bullish is probability-wise in your favor. And if you look at the last 100 years, you would have made lots of money if you're bullish. Now, that being said, it doesn't mean being bullish all the time is a good idea. Okay. So there are people who are perma bears. And let's take the perma bear argument. The perma bear argument is, oh my God, everything's expensive. The stock market's going to crash. You know these people, and some of them are notorious perma bears, and everyone knows them. And if you follow them, you should know. And there's a notorious one who also is very into precious metals, and he was telling you to short the S&P, buy metals, and short the dollar pretty much since 2008, in 2008, 2009 at the bottom. You would have lost all of your money and then some if you had listened to this dope. Now, this person, I'm not going to name him because I just call him a dope, and he is very well known. He is a well-known name, and you'd know if I heard him, okay? But he was telling you to short it. He was telling his clients to short it all the way up. Dumb move, right? He's a perma bear. But here's what intrigues people who are bearish. The perma bear argument is always the most logical and intellectually sound argument out there. So if you're convinced by perma bears, it means you're convinced by logic, because these people are very logical, and their deduction of why it's bearish is really sound. I look at it and say, I can't poke any holes in this. This is a really sound argument. However, the bulls usually win. Why? Because the markets are driven by emotion. They're not driven by logic. They're driven by emotion. So if you say, oh, this stock's expensive, I'm not going to invest. Amazon's been expensive since 2008. You would have made a bag load of money, trying to keep it clean here, a bag load of money if you were long Amazon from the bottom of like 2008 or maybe even 2002, it was like $1 or some crazy number, you would have made a boatload of money because at the time the fundamentals showed they were losing money or they didn't make money. However, their accounting was such that it hid the fact that they were actually very profitable. They just dumped it all back into the business. So the point is if you're looking at the perma bear arguments, then you have to really be careful because you're going to be wrong a lot. Now, they will also be accurate when the market does finally crash. However, they were accurate, they were bearish. What's the saying? They're bearish 3 out of the last, they were bearish 10 out of the last 3 recessions, right? So they're always bearish, and they're like, oh, they call for recession, doesn't happen. Oh, there's a recession next year. They'll eventually be right, but they'll be wrong a lot. So understand that this is how market participants operate. They operate in a way that forces people to really side with their opinion. Now, this is really hard. If you have a perma bull and a perma bear and you watch them, what you'll notice is sometimes they will deviate. So there's one notorious guy, and he's a Canadian, as Doug mentioned earlier. He's a really sharp guy. There are really smart Canadians up there, just they don't happen to be in politics. But this guy is really sharp. He's a perma bear. But there were times where he's said, you know what, I gotta become a bull. And oddly enough, those are the times that the market turns and becomes bearish. So, that's an indicator for me. I look at that and say, interesting. This guy is always bearish, but yet he's becoming bullish. What does that mean? Maybe I should pay attention to this. Now, it's not always the case. He's not always wrong on the turns. But the point is, I notice that and say, interesting. I'm going to put that in my hat for later use, and let's see if that's an indicator. Same thing with perma bulls. Sometimes they go a little bit crazy, and you get a little too bullish, and you say, that's interesting. Maybe we should note that. So the point is to always be mindful. And there's some people who are really interesting where they notice deviations in the market and they point them out. They say, that's interesting. I'm going to pay attention to that. Now, it doesn't mean I'm going to change my tune. Like right now, for instance, a lot of people are saying, hey, it's the fourth quarter. This is typically the time where the markets bounce. And if they're going to bounce now, and they can bounce hard. And the markets are extremes, and they're pointing all this stuff out. And I say, that's interesting. They could be right. And I'm prepared for that. Am I jumping on the bandwagon and going super long right now? Absolutely not. But am I prepared if things change and the markets do go up and they do change trend and bounce? Absolutely, I'm prepared for that. So you need to be prepared for understanding how your source of information react to different events. And you can interpret that in ways that are either beneficial or non-beneficial to you. The more beneficial is to you, or the more accurately you are to be able to determine your sources, right? So you don't just take it bar none, because there is nobody who's always right, right? I'm wrong, Doug's wrong, but Doug's rarely wrong, but he's late, but he's not wrong, but I think all of us are right and wrong in certain periods, right? Some people might be 90% right, but their their amplification of when they're right might be small, right? So you think about traders. You could have a 90% correct strategy where you're correct 90% of the time, but you only make 1% on each of those trades. And you might lose 10% you might lose 5% each time you're wrong, right? Which means you're losing 50%, you're making 90%, right? So depending on that, may be a winning or losing trade, right? Depending on how you're doing it. However, you might be right 10% of the time, but those 10% are up like 1,000%. Take venture capitalists. They're right 1 out of every 10 times. The good ones, right? So they invest in 10 companies. One is going to be like a 10 bagger, and the rest they'll be like, 2 or 3 might be like a double or triple. There's maybe like 3 or 4 that are like singles or break even. And then there's like 5 that are zeros. Total zeros, right? That's the math. They know that. So they're trying to find those 10 baggers, but they're going to get a lot of zeros to get there. But the math works out where they're making 20 to 30% a year on their portfolios because of that math. So understand that your lens on the world is really important. Interpreting that, and I'm going to end this. I'm going to point out a few of these people, and then gold bugs, permabulls, permabears, crypto fanatics, CEOs. They all have a perspective, and they all talk their book. Just understand that no one is telling you something who's totally true. Maybe me, maybe Doug, but virtually nobody is telling you something that they're unbiased. I have no bias. I don't care. If you become a client, great. If you don't, I don't care. I'm here to educate the public. I'm here to help people become better investors. That is why I'm here. So you don't hear me asking for your business and Doug. It's just not what we do. We're here to educate you because we want you to be better. So, but most people are talking a book. I want to leave you with this one quote, and then I'm gonna get into the news and let Doug talk a little bit. So there's one of my favorite quotes is arguably by Marcus Aurelius, and I say arguably because I couldn't find its origination. People say it's in the book Meditations. I haven't been able to find it yet. But anyway, people say it's from him. I'm going to go with that, but I'm going to caveat it with I haven't seconded this. And I do this, and I'm going to point this out because it's really important. When I quote people, I will tell you, quoting people is, if you quote people that are people quoted, I can tell you that probably 80, 90% of them are wrong, misinterpreted, incorrectly attributed, or just outright wrong. So, for instance, people say Einstein said that I forget, I'm going to misquote Einstein, but he basically said, compound interest is the most powerful force in the world. He didn't say anything.
The eighth wonder
of the world. He didn't say that. Right? He absolutely did not say that. Some clown made it up and attributed it to Einstein, and everybody's repeated him for like the last 20 years. There's a ton of these quotes out there like this. This is one that I hate, and it comes up a lot. I actually have a blog post that points out a bunch of these. But I do want to point one out, and I'm just pointing out that it may be misattributed, but it's a great quote, so I'm just going to say it. So it's attributed to Marcus Aurelius, and the quote is, "Everything we hear is an opinion, not a fact. Everything we see is a perspective, not the truth." Now, if anyone wants to argue with me on this, happily send in your emails or your quotes, and I'll happily point out the incorrectness, because I always find somebody, well, what about this? And I could tell you flat out that there's a lot of truth to this. Sit with it and reflect on it, and I guarantee you're going to learn a lot just from that quote alone. Now, let's get into the news, because you didn't come here for me to interpret philosophical quotes. So let's start with this point, and then we're going to dive into Doug. So actually, I'm going to let Doug give that one because I think there was a really good one here he sent. I'm going to let him have the pleasure of sending that. So I want to point out something here, and that is inflation, because we never talk about inflation on the show, right, Doug? I mean, inflation, never.
What's that?
So I want to point out this, what's going on, and I'm going to point it out verbally because I haven't had a chance to actually put this into visual, and maybe I'll do it next week. We talk about inflation, how it was high last year, right? And you could argue what it was 8, 9%, but people were claiming there was 30, 40, 50% in food, in energy prices and other things. And they're saying, well, I'm paying a lot more. Yes, you were. Okay, we're not going to argue that. You obviously were. But I do want to point this out because this perspective is really important as we talk about inflation. Most people don't understand it. They say, oh, well, it was 10% last year. Let's say it was 10. I'm just going to make the number simple. It's 10% last year. Okay, but this year it's only 3. That's awesome. Well, maybe. Okay, let's take that on its face. Okay, if last year, let's say we started the numbers in 2021, and let's say 2022 January, right? We take those numbers. So last year it was 10%. Okay, which means that you lost 10% of your purchasing power, because what inflation does is it eats away at your purchasing power. So you have one factor of inflation, which is up 10%. So let's say you started with $100. At the end of the year, your $100 is really worth 90. Okay, so it's 10% less. Now let's say you look at your salary. Okay, your salary is $100, just to make the math easy, right? So you made $100, and you were spending $100 a year. Okay, so now at the end of the year, your $100 is worth 90. but you had an increase in salary of 5%. Great. So your salary went from 100 to 110. I'm sorry, 105, right? So I'm going to try to square the math here. But your wages went up 5%, but the cost of that money went down 10%. So basically, your net is 95. Okay. So effectively, what we have here is we have inflation, which is increasing the cost of your spending of 10%. So it goes from 100 to 100. It goes 100 to 90, and then you got 5% bump or $5 bump in the year in wages. So that that $5 minus or plus 90 is 95. I'm trying to do this verbally. Sorry. Anyway, 95. So basically, you lost 5% of purchasing power, which means you're 5% poorer. Now, let's say the next year, right? So it's at 95. Let's say next year, inflation's only 3%. Ooh, that's awesome. And you got a 3% wage bump. Okay, so they even each other out. I'm just trying to make things simple. So they even each other out. You're still at 95. You're still 5% poorer than you were 2 years ago. So effectively, what's happened is, last year and the year before, inflation was running hot. And even though inflation was really low prior to that, it really was high during COVID. Anyway, so let's just take their numbers. And so if you take that inflation of before, we're still increasing inflation, just at a lesser degree. The problem is you can't make up for that last year. You're still 9% behind, or 10%. We're using our example, 10% behind or 5% behind for this example, right? Sorry, let me clarify. You're getting 5% behind using our example. So you're still behind. So you have to catch up. How are you going to catch up? Well, you have to have wages increase by 5% over inflation. Is that going to happen? I don't know. I mean, basically this year it means an 8% bump. Okay, well then you caught up. The problem is inflation's not accurately measuring the average American. So what's really happening? Well, your shoes might have gone up 30%, your food might have gone up 50%, your energy this year went up, 30%. All these things went up, which means that even though it's showing 3%, it's really more like 25, which means you're 25% poor minus whatever your wage bump is. That's the problem, is that we have a disconnect between what you're paying, the bump in what you're paying compared to what you're making. That is the problem we have with inflation, is you can't make that last year up easily. And this year, it may be more static. I would argue this year is a little more flat, so it's a little more give and take. You could say we have inflation, but wage bump a little bit, so it's about even. But we still have to make up for last year. People are poor. That's the problem. And now we have energy prices going up because of the Middle East war, and whatever happens out of that, I don't know. I mean, seeing the news, I don't watch the news. It's just horrible. But, we have some potential problems on the horizon, which, looks a lot like the 70s. Where have you heard that before, Doug? I don't know. Where have we heard that? Oh, yeah, on this show for like the last 2 years.
I was going to say deja vu.
Deja vu, yes. If you go the last 2 years, you're going to hear this over and over. We're repeating the 70s. I was early, but I don't think I'm going to be wrong, unfortunately, because the 70s were really horrible in a lot of reasons. And hopefully we don't repeat that, but I'm fearing that we will in a lot of ways. So, Doug, let's talk
a lot of whiskey abuse in the 70s, according to Mad Men, and that's probably, it may not. Remember, we always talk about correlation and causation. I don't know if it's correlated or caused, but it wasn't good. And that's something we can talk about another time, is how the human life expectancy of men to women actually used to be very much similar until we went through those years of the 60s and 70s where men were pretty much killing themselves on whiskey. So that's a different story for a different day.
Yeah, I'm sure women were killing themselves on vodka or whatever else they were drinking.
Ritalin pills.
Yeah, pills. Yeah, I mean, it was a tough period.
Vicodin, you name it.
All the good stuff.
And Valium. Vicodin wasn't around yet.
Yes. Well, let's dive into some of the news. Doug, we got tons of stuff to talk about here. You want to start us off?
Yeah, well, I mean, shoot, where do we start? We were gonna talk about correlation of returns of S&P and long-term Treasury bonds. I'll let you come back to that one. I think the biggest thing that I want to talk about, the news that we've got up here is what's going on. I mean, to the cost of capital. And I think there's still a tremendous amount of denial out there about what the impact of current conditions is going to translate to what it means to the average household. And you just touched on it. I mean, so inflation went up by 6-7%. And then the next year, it only went up by 3%, according to that. And you and I talked about this online because the Social Security Administration just came out and said that the increase of Social Security going into the next year is going to be about 3%. And we were bantering about this. Wasn't that the CPI? Of course it is. But the problem with that is that doesn't pay for the things that people need to pay for, right? So, we're starting to see an increasing struggle in cash flow. Families are running a family like a business runs a business. Okay, you have to take a look at what's coming into the household and what's going out of the household, and potentially, ideally, it's going to be more coming in than going out. But when incomes have been stagnant for so long compared to the increase in these other areas, unfortunately, we're starting to see that is going to be an issue that's going to lead to a deficit spend in the household. We all know deficit spending because we listen to our federal government do this all the time, except they have one thing the rest of the world, or the rest of America, businesses, municipalities, and families alike don't have, and that's the ability to dictate interest rates and basically, as people know, print money. Well, when it comes down to it, I think the one thing that's really interesting is, again, coming to the risk that's out there right now, coming to that free money that's come to an end. One thing somebody just posted last week that they got a credit card application, junk mail, right, for a new credit card from Capital One. Capital One has pushed a lot of advertising over the last 15 years to people about using their cards. Well, this came in. Annual percentage rate for purchase and transfers, if you were to accept this card, 32.74%. What does that mean mathematically? That means that if you have $10,000 that you put on that card and you can't pay it off, which again is becoming a greater and greater reality for a lot of families, that by the end of the first year, you will have $3,274 in interest on that card. Okay. Which means that just to service the debt on that card is going to cost you over almost $300 a month in cash flow just to pay, just to stay on top of it. And remember, credit cards are not just charging interest. They're charging a little bit of principal every month too. So you're looking at minimums. And the minimums historically used to be roughly about 2% on credit cards. At this interest rate, it can't be mathematically, right? So you're looking at $300 plus a month just to be able to meet the minimum requirements on this credit card, okay? So now you take a look at, we've talked about this before, student loans. A lot of families haven't been paying them. They're starting to hit back. Cash flow and prices have gone up astronomically. We're looking at double-digit % increases on basic needs like food in certain depending on certain items. Okay, one of the greatest places you could have invested in the last 12 months was orange juice. Okay, this is not a CPI of 3%. So if you start to look at trying to get by every month, people are going to be going a little bit further and further into using leverage in order to get by because the cash flow coming in the house is not meeting those demands. And now you take a look at what's going on with housing. And this is another one that we've talked about ad nauseum. There's a belief out there. And again, we talk about the perma bulls and perma bears. This happens in real estate as well. Okay. Bulls are consistently saying that no matter what happens, the housing market will be fine because everybody needs homes. And then they'll look at things like astronomical rent increases and say, that is a reason right there that people are going to buy a home, right? Because they don't want to be subjected to those astronomical rent increases. So they're going to want to fix that. So I've got two things to talk about in that, which I think are really, really important. First of all, is coming back to what that means on a cash flow basis. So if mortgage rates were 3%, 50 million households in America could qualify for a $400,000 mortgage. Okay. Now, if at 7%, so more than double, only 27 million families qualify. At 8%, you drop another 5 million. That's $22 million qualification. Okay. That's a credit eligibility shock. And this is where the real estate perma bulls seem to get caught up in the idealism that everybody would prefer to have a house that they owned over renting. They get caught up a little bit in the idealism that supply versus demand is going to continue to regulate these, continue to create these high housing pricing and keep your home rates up. And that is true to a limit. Okay. Because as long as there is a limited supply, which there really is right now, because as we know, ideally someone with a 3% mortgage is not going to be very, excited about going out there and listing their home, unless they don't intend to buy again. If you were to list a home that you're paying 3% on, or you've paid off, you're not going to be very encouraged to go out there and sell it, even if you can make a greater level of proceeds off the house, to turn around and go buy another house at 8%. I mean, your payment will be, hypothetically 3 times as much on the new home. Okay. It's just, for most people, doesn't make logical mathematical sense. And so, yes, when we take a look at the impact of real estate, majority of people will look at that and say, see, that's it. The prices are staying high. Look at the last month, it said that the average home sale prices went up again, right? Okay. Yes. Because the few that are listed against the few that can buy, those transactions are certainly, going to make it where it might be logical for that transaction to occur. But there's not enough being listed. The problem is now, this comes down to the supply demand argument comes down to the fact that you're saying that everybody who wants to buy a home is just going to be able to buy that home, and eventually they're just going to bite the bullet and buy it. Well, here's the problem. The majority of America cannot just take liquid cash and buy a home outright, right? Even if they could, that's a different conversation, whether or not they should. But if they want to go buy a $500,000, $400,000 home, and let's just say if we use a $400,000 mortgage in the example I did, that's 20% down on a $500,000. So a $500,000 home, if they have $500,000 cash, boom, they could buy it. But that's not the way almost 90% of America works. They have to get money from third party to buy a house. So guess what happens? They go to the bank. And we've said this before ad nauseum as well, that the banks have never in the history, I could be wrong on this, but as far as I know, in the history of mortgage lending, banks have never lent against a house. They're not giving you money for a house. They couldn't care less about the house. You're probably listening, what do you mean? It's a mortgage. It's against a house. No. Mortgages are actually a loan against your income. That's all they care about. It is a personal loan against your income. And they are looking at that. That's why you have to fill out a stack of paper this big. That's why it is so much about what you make per month. And actually, and this is a real story, there's a family I know that has $2 million in liquid brokerage, and they had a $2 million house, but they got laid off during COVID. They wanted to get a mortgage to get some liquidity on their house. They couldn't. The bank said, you don't have any income. And this is a problem if you go into retirement and you try to take out a mortgage in retirement, you're not going to get it if you don't have income. It's a loan against your income. Now, the banks recognize that income is very volatile. We go into this recession, there could be a lot of layoffs. So when the bank loans to you, they're loaning against the income you're making at the moment. But just in case that changes, that's why they attach the house to it. It is secured by the house. The house is only there in order to protect the bank if your income changes. As a fail-safe, they could eventually take the home. They don't want the home. Trust me, the banks wanted nothing to do with all the real estate they took on after 2008. Okay, but as people were walking away, the banks were stuck with it. At least it gave them something. The other thing that goes into that equation is, this is why you have to, if you've ever noticed, if anybody out there has accidentally missed an insurance payment or got behind on escrow, all of a sudden your bank is sitting there saying, look, your house isn't insured right now. This is a problem with the loan. Either fix it or we've got a problem. Because guess what? If you're not insured and you have a fire and the house loses all its value and can't be paid, the insurance company just lost its collateral. This is where you have to understand how this works. A house is nothing more than a security blanket for the home. So guess what? If these people, these 90% of Americans or so, I'm making up that number, but it's a lot, go out there and try to live the ideal and buy a home. Well, we just took from 3% to 8%, we just took 27 million households out of the ability to get a $400,000 mortgage. Okay, perma bulls, supply and demand, right? Yes, everybody wants a home, but the banks just basically said 27 million are not going to be able to get that home anymore. That's supply and demand. Your supply just plummeted because yes, everybody, we love the stories that were going on a couple of years ago where like I put my house on the market and it had like 20 offers in one day, which I've never experienced in the 3 or 4 homes I've sold during that market. Never had that many. So I don't know. But listen, the thing is that, yes, that was great because you had 50 million homes at 3% that were all going out there saying, I want a home and I can qualify. You take 27 million people out of that equation, that demand just dropped like a rock. Now, the supply is still not there because people aren't moving. They're not listing the homes. That's why there's still an equilibrium that's keeping those prices high. But this is not a supply demand. This is not a I want a home issue. This is a bank issue. This is a liquidity issue. And the banks are not going to just underwrite 27 million homes that they did before. That's going to cause a problem at a time. Now, when's that problem going to occur is the question. Well, guess what? That's where the perma bull equation comes back into another thing where I have to say, you've got to look beyond your idealism. Okay? Because here's the other argument that's being stated. The people with a 3% mortgage are they're not going to sell their home. Why would they? I mean, come on, they're locked at 3%. Those homes will never be available. Let's think of some reasons why they might. Number one, death. A lot of those 3% mortgages are owned by people who are aging. And as they die, they are going to leave those homes to someone else. If the home is paid off, even if it's paid off, many of their next of kin, they're not going to want another home. If they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and they've got children who are in their 40s and 50s, their children probably, for the most part, already have a home. So taking on another home is not going to be ideal. That's going to create a reason to sell the home. Okay. As more baby boomers and we still have some greatest generation out there, as they pass away, those homes will become available. Let's talk about a second reason, job loss. Okay, we are now going into a situation where we're seeing declining profits for companies. I just read an article about a number of small businesses here within the city that are going to be closing up shop. Okay. And again, that's also going to happen on big businesses as profits go down. It's the first thing they do. Well, guess what? You were given this mortgage against your income. Sounds fine and dandy. And let's face it, the reason that mortgages are so prevalent is that they are the last thing people are going to pay. The first thing you're going to let is your credit card balances go up, right? Because what's the worst thing they can do? Harass you. Eventually, you declare bankruptcy. Nobody wants to lose shelter. But eventually, families are going to get to a point where they can't cover that cost either if they don't have the cash flow. And guess what? A home may be forced to go on sale to get out from underneath. Either it's going to be repossessed, they're going to go into foreclosure, or they're going to be forced to sell it to get out of that. What's a third reason? And this one I think is one that is really misunderstood, is that mortgages it's a fixed cost, right? I've seen plenty of people talking about, hey, if I've got a 3% mortgage and we go back to that that qualification on a $400,000 home. I'm not crunching the amortization numbers. Let's just say it's around a $200,000 or a $2,000 a month, maybe $1,500 to $2,000 a month mortgage payment. Okay, and people, that's not all because you have insurance and you have taxes. Now, I've heard this argument. Well, you don't have to do escrow. It doesn't matter. You got to pay them either way. It's still cash flow. And if you don't pay the insurance, you don't pay the taxes, the bank will have a problem with that, as well as the local municipality. And people think that's fixed. They're like, well, I have a mortgage. It's fixed. Even the people who've paid off the homes. Well, if you pay off your mortgage, now you own the home outright. No, you don't. Your municipality always owns your home. First lien on it. Okay. They're going to get the property taxes. No matter what you do, whether it's a 100-year lease on the land or you own the land, at the end of the day, you're still leasing it from the county you live in. It's just the reality of it. You will have to pay those taxes. So here's what's happening now. We're starting to see escrow shortfalls because we had such a massive increase in the valuation of homes that the tax bases started to get behind on how much they were going to assess, and escrow accounts started to get behind on how much they needed to assess because taxes went up with valuations. But guess what also went up with valuations? Insurance, because now it's more expensive to do anything on your home. So if you think you have a 3% mortgage, are you safe? Not necessarily. I saw an article the other day, a post the other day, where someone's mortgage payment went up $900 a month. Now, I just talked about the impact of paying a $300 on a credit card at 33%. But if you're going through and you're already tight, okay, it's hard we're seeing people getting behind on the cost of food going up by a couple hundred a month. If you all of a sudden get assessed $900 more a month, and why is that happening? Because the escrow account had a shortfall. And when there's a shortfall on property taxes or insurance, the escrow will pay that. But then what they will do is they'll go back, raise your escrow going forward, and assess an extra amount to make up for the shortfall that already occurred. So now your $2,000 payment becomes close to $3,000 just to make up for the underestimation of taxes and insurance. And guess what? The bank freaks out, and ultimately you freak out because you don't have that money. And now you run into a situation where, okay, same people. So while I was locked at 3%, I'm never going to sell. I can't afford $900 more a month, plus my student loans, plus my increase in food. People, this is not to be completely bearish here, but I think the reason I'm going bearish here is because I want to counter the consistent bullish argument that real estate is strictly about people wanting homes and not enough homes to meet that demand. There are so many more variables that go into this, not only for the people that want to get homes and what they'll be approved for, but also secondarily, what it truly costs to maintain a home going forward. And what I just talked about in escrow still doesn't deal with repairs, right? Repair costs are going through the roof because if people are moving, there's only so many people that can do the work. So cash flow is being impacted even on people who you would think at 3% would never want to sell their home. Those pressures are increasing every single day. And all of these things, if you have deaths, if you have job losses, and you just have increasing cash flow beyond capacity for households, that can lead to, I'm not making predictions here, a spike in sales at a time in which the demand of borrowers is still very, very low. And guess what that leads to? Unhappy valuations. And therefore, that's where I think, at the end of the day, there's a lot more that you have to understand and how the dynamics of cash flow work when it comes to real estate. And that is something that, whether it's today or in the future, cash flow is the number one thing that people need to think about that drives everything, that I don't think enough people put thought into when they make these predictions and these statements, bullish or bearish.
Yeah, totally agree, Doug. And as we're kind of hitting on time here, we're going to wrap it up. I did want to, let Doug wrap it up. So Doug, where can people find more about you?
Well, one of the biggest areas of inflation has been college. It's a big cost. And we talked about student loans coming back in. Listen, I just went on a college tour with my daughter this past week here. And listen, it was surprising to me the lack of questions people ask. Okay. I was sitting there asking questions because I own a company, Pro College Planners. Go to procollegeplanners.com, learn more about it. But I'm asking critical questions about graduation rates and the job, how people are getting jobs. People aren't asking those questions. To me, it was a critical statement that I already knew, but it reiterated how little people understand about this process. And what you don't know can cost you. Don't ask the right questions. You don't get into the right school, or you don't get the right money. There was a number of different scholarships. It was mind-blowing, the scholarships that were out there that people weren't aware of. Listen, it's up to you. You're the adults. If you want to pay too much, just do it the old-fashioned way. If you want to have your child potentially not happy or end up in a place for the wrong reasons, do it the old-fashioned way. But if you want to get ahead of the curve, if you want to do it differently, get the information you need. ProCollegePlanners.com, that's a starting point. There's lots of information out there, but do your research, get your knowledge before you make these decisions.
All right. Well, Doug, I really appreciate you coming on the show. We're going to wrap it up here. One final thought for my intro here. We're talking about cultivating sources. So I was trying to find my notes and finally found them. So I wanted to leave listeners with, kind of like an instruction manual of how to cultivate sources. So here's some points that I thought would be helpful. First, stay away from major media. Most of it's propaganda or paid for advertising. And yes, there is news on there as well. But if you can determine that fact from fiction, let me know, because I don't know anybody who can. Second one is find independent sources and follow them for a while to get to know their perspective. So obviously, independent sources, they're not major media. You could argue, well, major media, they're vetted. I could tell you plenty of examples, but that's not true. But independent sources also have the same problem, right? So you have a data validity problem anywhere you go nowadays. There's no Walter Cronkite you can say, oh, there's a reputable guy, right? Like that just doesn't exist today. Even government data is questionable. So, but you have to take something at face value. So, point being is find independent sources. Ideally, people who are really diligent. So, somebody who can go through the numbers and actually have a very strong explanation about why their methodology works. Now, obviously, that doesn't work for everybody, but for some people, you look at it and be like, yeah, that makes sense. That's a good metric. There's a lot of metrics that Wall Street uses that they don't disclose to the public because they've got their own methodologies and they don't want to share them. Many of them are available on websites. But anyway, find your independent sources and follow them for a while just to make sure like you get a feel for who they are, their accuracy, that sort of stuff. Also find competing sources. Find a Republican source and a Democrat source, an independent source. Like find things that are competing with each other. Because what you'll find is, if one's right and one's wrong, may not be accurate. If both are right, it might be accurate, right? Because if it's that accurate that they're both agreeing, then it might actually be true. If neither of them agree with it, then it's like, well, I don't know, maybe not. So, but just get a feel for that. Get competing sources. It's hard to do, but it's very valuable if you can find those competing sources. Find people who know who know how to think. Okay, so there are people who are thinkers, and there aren't many out there, but you can find them. Like Shane Parrish, an example. He's got a great blog and a podcast, and his whole thing is about how to think. It's about mental models and mindset and things like that. But there's other people out there too who are really good at thinking. Now he's not a finance guy, but just if you want to learn how to think, it's a good way to kind of swizzle your brain a little bit and get you out of your own shell. Also, challenge your own views. If you can't challenge your own opinion, you're doing yourself a disservice. We all think we're correct. And I think one of the hardest things to do is to go against our own ego because we don't want to be wrong. That's one of the things that we as human beings don't like is being wrong. And the better you are at challenging your own opinions about the world, the better able you are going to be able to deconstruct them and say, okay, maybe I'm incorrect here. Maybe, put yourself in a position where you could be wrong and say, all right, am I wrong or is this other person wrong? And think about it, right? Spend some time thinking. It's really important. Also, as we talk about in the show here a lot, look for outliers. Like that every time you say, isn't that interesting? That's an outlier, right? Oh, this person's always bullish and now they're bearish. Oh, isn't that interesting, right? So look for the outliers and stop and pause and say, all right, what am I missing? Right? You should always be asking yourself, what am I missing here? Where am I wrong? Those are great questions to ask yourself, because if you do that in life, not just the markets, you're going to get further ahead in everything because you're not set upon this path that your brain is wired to set you on. You can stop and look around, as they said in Ferris Bueller, if you don't stop to look around once in a while, you might miss it, right? And I think that applies to a lot of things. So if you can stop and look and say, isn't that interesting for things, I think you'll find you get a lot of benefit from that. So we're going to wrap it up. I'm not going to get into stock and bond correlations. I'm going to save that till next week. That is a tremendous study of WTF that will kind of swizzle your brain quite a bit. So I'm excited to talk about that next week. But as for now, that's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us, Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name is Kirk Chisholm, wealth manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on the show. Please remember to subscribe to the show on moneytreepodcast.com. Or sorry, I screwed that up. Please remember to subscribe to the podcast and the podcast app of your choosing. You can also check out the show at moneytreepodcast.com. On the website, you'll have access to our show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Now we're on YouTube, so please check out our YouTube channel. When you're there, please subscribe and leave a comment. Lastly, please leave a show rating and comment on the podcast app of your choice. Oh, and don't forget, do your own research. This show is for informational use only. We're not telling you what to think, merely how to think about investing. We're also not selling any products or services, so do not consider this advice. If you have any problems with the show, I blame Putin. So please send an email, express your feelings. If you're seeking financial advice, talk to an oracle or a fortune teller or maybe just a licensed financial advisor. I'm one, but as I said earlier, I'm not selling anything. But I'm easy to find. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.